On this edition of Crime Chronicles, we go back to August 1992. I am in Boundary County, Idaho, just south of the Canadian border. The nearest towns are the county seat of Bonners Ferry and the unincorporated community of Naples. We're going to take a look at an event that galvanized the American far right and brought the actions of the federal government under the type of scrutiny it had not seen in a long time and has not seen really since. It's the Ruby Ridge standoff involving the Randy Weaver family. It's hard to be brief and briefly sum up what happened here, but it goes something like this. In late August 1992, the family of Randy, Vicki Weaver, their three daughters and their son, and a young man who was living with them off and on again named Kevin Harris, were holed up in an area of where I am now called Ruby Ridge on the top of a mountain, about 7 or 8 miles from here. What had happened was Randy Weaver had been arrested on a charge of a federal crime of selling a sawed-off shotgun. He had failed to appear for his court date. The U.S. Marshal Service took charge of the matter at that point because it's their job to hunt down all fugitives from justice, including people who don't show up for court. And while we'll get into more detail about what happened later on, while the marshals were conducting a surveillance, trying to go about finding the best way to apprehend Randy Weaver, a gunfight ensued in which Randy Weaver's 14-year-old son, Sammy, was killed by a federal marshal. One of the federal marshals was also killed, as was the Weaver's family dog. At that point, the matter had snowballed and escalated, and it resulted in a standoff that lasted for about 2 weeks. And it also involved the killing of Vicki Weaver and the wounding of Kevin Harris and the wounding of Randy Weaver at the hands of a U.S. Marshal named Lon Terriochi.
Ruby Ridge is the southernmost of 4 ridges that extend east from the bottleneck Roman Nose mountain range toward the Kootenai River. The standoff occurred approximately 10 miles from the nearest incorporated city of Bonners Ferry and a few miles from Naples, and approximately 30 miles south of the border with British Columbia. I filmed most of this footage on the Kootenai Wildlife Refuge between Naples and Bonners Ferry.
Who were the Weavers? Who was Randy Weaver? Who was Vicki Weaver? And what brought them to this point? It starts rather innocuously with a typical middle class or lower middle class upbringing in Iowa.
Randall Claude Weaver, or Pete as many called him, was born January 3rd, 1948 in Iowa. After graduating from high school and dropping out of college, he entered the Army, where he attained the rank of sergeant and was a Green Beret, a factor which would be key in the deadly standoff in 1992. Weaver served from 1968 to 1970. Although his service came at the height of the Vietnam War, Weaver never saw combat. He married Vicki Jordison after leaving the Army and worked in factory jobs, including at a John Deere plant. The Iowa agricultural economy was failing in the 1980s, and many farmers were losing or selling their land. It seemed the traditional ways of life were vanishing in Iowa, and Randy Weaver was afraid of losing his livelihood as well.
I think one should be careful, at least I try to be, of criticizing someone else's religious beliefs that are different from mine. After all, I think pretty much all religious beliefs may look crazy or wrong or strange to an outsider. But in the Weavers' case, their beliefs fell far outside the mainstream Christianity and far away from the beliefs that were shared by both of their parents. The Weavers fell into line with a strain of thought sometimes referred to as British Israelism or something like that. And one of the primary tenets of this belief is that whites are supreme to other ethnic groups and that Jews are of the devil. Now, if one looks at the book of Genesis, we usually know the story of Adam and Eve and Cain and Abel, how Cain killed his brother Abel. But who was the son of Adam and Eve that carried on their legacy? It wasn't Cain. It was a third son named Seth. Now, what the Weavers believed, and what people like them believe, is that the descendants of Cain, or the descendants of the devil more or less, those are the Jews. And that the godly line, white Christians or white adherents to God, were the descendants of Seth. As for African Americans, the Weavers and people like them believed that they were the descendants of a group of beings mentioned in the book of Genesis and also in the apocryphal book of Enoch, that there were sons of gods, it says in the Old Testament, which are really devils more or less, that descended onto earth and impregnated earthly women. And those descendants of the devil also, or called mud people, comprise the African American race. One of the things I think about the Bible is this, I suppose both good and bad. One can read it and take away whatever message one wants to, or one can read the passages or focus on the passages they think are important and simply ignore the others. With the Weavers, the areas of the Bible that emphasize loving thy neighbor and things like that took a back seat to other passages. More specifically, the Weavers believed more in the Old Testament than the New, and the portions of the scripture they focused on the most were those dealing with the end times of the end of the world. To illustrate how far outside the mainstream the Weavers were with their religious beliefs, they did not refer to Jesus as Jesus. They said Jesus is a pagan name. And so they referred to God as Yeshua, or a derivative of Jehovah. And they would not say the name Jesus. They wouldn't observe Christmas as a pagan holiday. So they're pretty far outside the mainstream of most Christian beliefs. Both Randy and Vicki Weaver were raised in a middle-class home in Iowa. And as far as religion goes, they adhere to pretty much what a lot of mainstream Christians adhere to in the Midwest. So at what point did they make somebody call a radical change in their religious beliefs?
Although Randy was the primary breadwinner, Vicki was the religious leader in the family. In the late 1970s, she started having dreams of the apocalypse and believed the end of the world was approaching. She took to heart the biblical commandment against graven images and banished televisions from their home. The Weavers also embraced elements of Christian identity, which held that white people of European descent are God's chosen. This caused a rift between many of their friends and family members who adhered to more mainstream Christian beliefs. Vicki also latched onto a passage of Matthew's Gospel, which spoke of wars and rumors of wars in the end times, as if war were anything new. Every current event simply reinforced their religious beliefs, that the world was coming to an end, that the U.S. government was controlled by a Zionist conspiracy, and that the government, especially the federal government, was evil and out to get them. After the birth of their son Samuel, the Weavers began selling their belongings and visited the Amish to learn how to live without electricity. They bought 20 acres of land on Ruby Ridge in 1983, just northwest of Naples.
When the Weavers moved to Ruby Ridge in the 1980s, Vicki Weaver had already figured out the time of the apocalypse when the world was going to end. When that didn't happen, she had to revise that. And the Weavers still had to scrape to get by. And mind you, they were feeding themselves, and at that time, 3 children. Why did the Weavers move away from Iowa here to Idaho? There were several reasons. For one, the Weavers had come to believe that public school systems were corrupt, sinful, and they wanted to homeschool their children. Now, at that time, families in Iowa could not do that. So they wanted to go to a state where they could homeschool their children. There was more than that, though. Vicki Weaver, in particular, had studied the Bible and had come to the conclusion that the end of the world was at hand and was only a few years away. And so Vicki and Randy Weaver wanted to be prepared for the end of the world. And the best place to do that was on top of a mountain mountains like here in Idaho. When it came time to actually find a place to live, as I said a while ago, the Weavers had to find a place they could afford, land they could afford. And so time was running short as far as finding a place they could afford and still having money. Well, they found a place in the Ruby Ridge area. Interesting thing is this. they decided to build their house on top of the mountain. Now, Randy Weaver was not exactly a do-it-yourselfer. He had probably better skills around the house than I do, which is not saying very much. He didn't have any expertise in construction, things of that nature, but they were bound to determine. Now, they put their house at the top of the hill, and Vicky Weaver's father, who knew about construction, thought this was crazy because said, okay, you're living here, but there's a much better area for your house, and it's on your property, but it's much further down and much better situated for a house than on top of the mountain. But why did the Weavers persist in putting their house on top of the mountain? As for why the Weavers wanted their house on top of the mountain, the reasons had more to do with theology than good common sense. If you read the Bible, you notice that good things happen on top of mountains. You're closer to God that way, and bad things happen when one's in the valley. For instance, Moses went to the top of the mountain, Mount Sinai, to get the 10 Commandments. Jesus went to the top of the mountain to be transfigured before 3 of his disciples. And there are other examples of that. And so it's easy to kind of maintain the belief that being on the mountaintop is a good thing. For instance, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., his last speech before he was shot, talks about having been to the mountaintop. So being on top of the mountain is good. Vicky Weaver also believed that when the world ended, that on top of the mountain was a better place to be than down in the valley among sinners.
In biblical prophecy, mountains often symbolize stability, strength, and God's presence. Specific prophecies, particularly those in the Old Testament book of Ezekiel, foretell both judgment and restoration concerning the mountains of Israel. Located in Jerusalem, Mount Zion is a symbol of the city and the temple, representing the center of Israelite worship in David's kingdom. On Mount Moriah, Abraham nearly sacrificed his son Isaac and built a temple. On Mount Carmel, the prophet Elijah demonstrated God's power with the prophets of Baal. On the Mount of Olives, Jesus ascended into heaven. On Mount Ararat, Noah's Ark came to rest after the flood. In a documentary, Sarah Weaver claimed that she and her siblings enjoyed their life. They read prodigiously, enjoyed a loving household, and did not long for the perks of everyday life that most children their age knew. They enjoyed their household chores and were as happy as any other set of children their age. The Weavers took in a teenage boy named Kevin Harris, who came from a troubled Washington home and adopted the Weavers' religious beliefs and their hatred of the federal government. Harris spent a substantial amount of time at the Weavers' house the next several years.
Things were difficult for the Weavers financially. For one thing, the house they built was really just thrown together. They did it themselves with no particular expertise. It was not exactly a marvel of construction and barely held together, but it did the job. But Randy Weaver always had problems making ends meet as far as money went. No matter how much one tries to live off the land in our current civilization, our current society, one needs money. And that was a problem for Randy Weaver. The Weavers also needed socialization. Although they were separatist to a great extent, they still needed people. Now, one thing worth noting is that one might assume that the people who live up here, it's kind of has a communal feel to it, everyone gets along. That's not true. And the Weavers had a lot of problems with certain neighbors.
Although the Weavers distrusted government in general, they were not above using the law to further their own interest. In 1984, Randy Weaver and his neighbor Terry Kennison had a dispute over a $3,000 land deal. Kennison lost the ensuing lawsuit and was ordered to pay Weaver an additional $2,100 in court costs and damages. Kennison wrote letters to the FBI, the Secret Service, and the Sheriff of Boundary County, in which he alleged that Weaver had threatened to kill Pope John Paul II and President Ronald Reagan, both of whom had been wounded by would-be assassins in 1981. Weaver also reportedly threatened to kill Idaho Governor John Evans.
Throughout the 1980s and early 1990s, this area of Idaho, northern Idaho, had gradually become a refuge or a home for far-right conservative groups or far-right religious groups. Nowadays, the news media refers to anyone who is conservative as far-right. But the conservatives of today bear no resemblance to the right-wingers that populated portions of northern Idaho in the 1980s and 1990s. The most prominent group of people who were known for living in this area was a group called the Aryan Nations. The Aryan Nations' most prominent spokesman was a man named Richard Butler. There were other groups of far-right radicals here in northern Idaho, and there wasn't so much a tight-knit hierarchical organization where one person controlled everything. It was more of a loose confederation of organizations, or in organizations, it might be too strong a word, of groups of people that had certain beliefs in common, but not everything. Now, most of the people, like Richard Butler, talked about white supremacy and the need to sort of take America back from, especially big cities, from ethnic minorities, especially African Americans, that had taken over governments in big cities and so forth, along with a virulent distrust or outright hatred of the federal government.
Born in 1918, Richard Butler was an aeronautical engineer in California. Although he served in the Army during World War II, he developed an admiration for Adolf Hitler. An adherent to Christian identity and British Israelism, Butler eventually moved to Idaho and founded Aryan Nations, a white supremacist fascist group. Butler and his adherents were a scourge and an embarrassment to most northern Idaho residents. While many Idahoans were politically conservative, favored gun ownership, and distrusted the federal government, very few agreed with the hateful rhetoric espoused by people like Richard Butler, Aryan Nations, and their skinhead compatriots.
Fortunately, most of the right-wing radicals that were here in Idaho were mostly talk, including Richard Butler. But there were some people, though, that thought that Richard Butler's talk was not enough. And they wanted to take steps to effect a revolution, one that favored them, of course. And one of the most prominent groups who did that was a group called the Order.
The Order was a splinter group of Aryan Nations. Their most prominent leader, Robert Matthews, and others were notorious for committing robberies in the Northwest and were linked to the murder of Alan Berg, a liberal Jewish radio talk show host in Denver. Robert Matthews was killed in a shootout with federal agents in Freeland, Washington in 1984.
Did Randy and Vicki Weaver move their family from Iowa to Idaho, this part of Idaho, in order to join up with the Aryan Nations and groups like that? Probably not. We're not even sure if they even knew that these groups were prominent or even existed here. They simply wanted to get away from everyone to the greatest extent possible and still survive. When they finally moved up here, they found a place on Ruby Ridge and an area of land they could afford because Randy Weaver had quit his job, and they decided to, we say, live off the grid. Well, they took this to an extreme. Vicki Weaver, they grew and canned and stored a lot of their own food. They would go hunting, in some cases, to supply meat for the family. But Randy Weaver did get jobs as best he could, and they didn't totally isolate themselves from the rest of the world. In fact, Randy Weaver even launched an unsuccessful bid for sheriff of Boundary County. Didn't fare very well. Vicki Weaver, it turned out later on, had the family apply for and received food stamps. And so it's impossible for people to live in total isolation. The Weavers also wanted to socialize with people and have their children socialize with people. And while they would not feel at home with a lot of the residents here in Boundary County who were just decent mainstream folks going about their business, they felt a kindred spirit to some extent with a lot of people involved in the Aryan Nations. And so they started attending meetings and rallies held by the Aryan Nations. Now, were Randy and Vicki Weaver kind of card-carrying members? No, not at all. Although they shared some beliefs and they had some friends involved in these groups, Randy Weaver alternately said that he despised the Aryan Nations. He called some of their members punks, but nevertheless, there were some ties there. Because of their persistent anti-government statements and the criminal activities of some members of the Aryan Nations, the federal government was hot and heavy to get these people. And the two agencies that were most persistent in their pursuit of the Aryan Nations were the FBI and the ATF, Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms. So the Aryan Nations had to be very wary of informants in their midst. And another thing that's interesting is that the ATF had their informants and the FBI had their informants, and they didn't know who their counterparts were.
On February 12, 1985, Randy and Vicki Weaver were interviewed by the FBI, the Secret Service, and the Boundary County Sheriff's Office. The Secret Service had been told that Weaver was a member of Aryan Nations and that he had a large supply of weapons at his residence. No charges were filed. The Weavers had attended Aryan Nations meetings at Hayden Lake, where there was a compound for far-right government resistors and white supremacists and separatists. The Weavers' paranoia over the federal government escalated, and their paranoia merely exacerbated their problems, as their actions invited government scrutiny. On May 6, 1985, the Weavers sent President Ronald Reagan a letter claiming their enemies may have sent Reagan a threatening letter under a forged signature. That letter would be used in Weaver's trial in 1992.
Sometimes law enforcement, when it comes to informants, they use people who are actively involved in the organization, sort of an insider, and they may pay them some on the sides, at like Crime Stoppers, things like that, for tips. In other cases, being an informant can be a full-time profession. And that was the case with the informant involved with Randy Weaver, who was working for the ATF. Randy Weaver was desperate for money. And so he and this informant start talking to each other. And Randy Weaver always claims that the informant asked him if he could supply a sawed-off shotgun for him. The informant, not surprisingly, conversely claimed that Randy Weaver approached him about selling a sawed-off shotgun. No matter. Eventually, Randy Weaver sawed off a few shotguns and sold them to this informant, and that was a violation of federal law.
The Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms first became aware of Weaver in July 1986 when he was introduced to a confidential ATF informant at a meeting at the World Aryan Congress. The informant's name was Gus Magisono, but he went by the alias Ken Fatally. Magisono was a professional ATF informant and a former security expert. He posed as a weapons dealer working with motorcycle gangs. Magisono joined the white supremacist rhetoric used by Weaver and Aryan nations to gain their trust, which was not an easy task. Northern Idaho was riddled with government informants, and everyone, including Magisono, was viewed with suspicion. Weaver had been invited to the meeting by Frank Kumnick, the original target of the ATF investigation. In time, the ATF came to see Kumnick as long on talk but short on action, and Weaver was a bit player. Over the next 3 years, Weaver and Magisono met several times. In July 1989, Weaver invited Magisono to his home to discuss forming a group to fight the ZOG, or the Zionist Organized or Occupied Federal Government. In October 1989, Weaver sold Magisono 2 sawed-off shotguns, with the overall length of the guns shorter than the limit set by federal law. A few months later, an FBI informant named Rico Valentino outed Magisono to leaders of Aryan nations.
It seems pretty clear that Randy Weaver was neither a big name or a big player in the Aryan nations, and that he was not sawing off shotguns in mass quantities in his little cabin. He only sawed off a few and sold a few just to get some money to feed his family. Now, I'm not defending it because it is a violation of the law, and he knew that. But when the undercover operative, when the informant, when his cover was more or less blown by the Aryan nations, he had to go to the ATF and say, okay, the jig is up. I didn't bag any big names in the Aryan nations, but I do have this guy, Randy Weaver. And what you can do there is you can use Randy Weaver, who's a small fish, who sold these sawed-off shotguns, to get to bigger fish.
In June 1990, ATF agent Herb Byerly attempted to use the sawed-off shotgun charge as leverage to get Weaver to act as an informant for his investigation of the Aryan nations. Weaver refused to become a snitch. In fact, Weaver told Aryan Nations leadership about the ATF's offer and his refusal. The ATF filed the gun charges in June 1990. The ATF alleged that Weaver was a bank robber with criminal convictions. Those claims were false. At that time, Weaver had no criminal record and was not a suspect in any other crimes. A federal grand jury indicted Weaver in December 1990 for making and possessing, but not for selling, illegal weapons.
Well, the ATF said okay. And so it came time to try to arrest Randy Weaver. That was not going to be easy because Randy Weaver was literally on top of a mountain, which was very difficult to get to. And so the ATF, like some of the law enforcement agencies, decided to employ a little trickery. It's worth noting that every step the government took against Randy Weaver enhanced his hatred and distrust of the federal government, starting with the way that he was arrested. The ATF had 2 agents stationed on the side of the road, a male and a female, posing as a couple whose car had broken down. And they knew that Randy and Vicki Weaver would be passing that way. And so, sure enough, as the car is quote-unquote broken down, Randy Weaver and Vicki Weaver approach and stop and get out to help. And that's when the 2 agents pounce on the Weavers, and other ATF agents arrive and place Randy Weaver under arrest and take him for his first appearances in federal district court.
The deceptive arrest came in January 1991, and the deception, along with the physical force employed against Vicki, further reinforced Weaver's hatred and distrust of the federal government.
And it was in federal district court where the comedy of errors began with the handling of the Randy Weaver case. A few things went wrong. Randy Weaver was eventually released on bail, but there were at least 2 mistakes made. One was when the federal magistrate told Randy Weaver that he had better cooperate with the agents here, because if he were convicted of these charges, he would lose his property. And that was not true. But Randy Weaver did not know that, and so more distrust of the federal government. On top of that, Randy Weaver was given a court date. It was the wrong court date. And chances are Randy Weaver would not have voluntarily gone to court anyway, but since he failed to appear for court Now, a second agency has gotten involved. It moves from the Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms ATF agency to the U.S. Marshals, whose job is to hunt down fugitives, including people who fail to appear for court.
Now, listen closely, because this even confuses me as I'm reading it, and one can imagine how it confused Randy Weaver and others involved. Weaver was told that his next court date was February 19, 1991. On January 22nd, the judge in the case appointed attorney Everett Hoffmeister as Weaver's legal representative. The same day, Weaver called probation officer Carl Richens and told him he had been instructed to contact Richens on that date. Federal probation officers work with defendants awaiting trial, as well as those that have been convicted and under sentence. Richens asked Weaver to leave his contact information and said he would contact him when he received the paperwork. According to Richens, Weaver did not leave a telephone number, most likely because Weaver had no telephone at his residence, and cell phones didn't exist. Hoffmeister sent Weaver letters on January 19th, January 31st, and February 5th, asking Weaver to contact him to work on his defense, but he received no response. Weaver had no more faith in a lawyer paid by the government than any other government employee. On February 5th, the trial date was changed from February 19th to February 20th to give participants more travel time following President's Day. The court clerk sent the parties a letter informing them of the date change, but the notice was not sent directly to Weaver, only to Hoffmeister. On February 7th, probation officer Richens sent Weaver a letter which erroneously said that Weaver's trial date was March 20th. On February 8th, Hoffmeister again attempted to contact Weaver by letter, informing him that his next court date was February 20th and that Weaver needed to contact him immediately. Hoffmeister also made several calls to individuals who knew Weaver, asking them to have Weaver call him. When Randy Weaver did not appear in court on February 20th, Judge Harold Ryan issued a bench warrant for failure to appear in court. On February 26th, Ken Keller, a reporter for the Kootenai Valley Times, telephoned the U.S. Probation Office. He asked whether Weaver did not show in court on February 20th because the letter Richens sent him had an incorrect court date. Upon finding a copy of the letter, the chief probation officer, Terrence Hummel, contacted Judge Ryan's clerk and informed them of the incorrect date in the letter. Hummel also contacted the U.S. Marshals Service and Weaver's attorney, informing them of the error. But Judge Ryan inexplicably refused to withdraw the bench warrant, making Weaver a fugitive from justice. The Marshals Service agreed to put off executing the warrant until after March 20th to see if Weaver would show up on court that day. But, in yet another example of poor interagency communication, a grand jury indicted Weaver for failure to appear. The indictment came on March 14th, 6 days ahead of the announced court date.
Now, as for the marshals going out and arresting people who don't appear in court, a lot of times it's pretty simple. You simply go to the person's house, making sure you're armed, the area's secure, and things like that, knock on the door or go into the door and say, hey, you're under arrest, you didn't go to court. They knew it would not be easy, that easy at least, to apprehend Randy Weaver. And so the marshals engaged in what they call threat assessment. In other words, when we're trying to apprehend this guy, we need to make sure that we don't get hurt, and if possible, they don't get hurt. And they knew that since he was literally on top of a mountain, in a thickly wooded area, it would not be easy to just simply walk up and knock on the door and say, hey, Randy, how about turning yourself in? And plus, they had talked to people that knew Randy Weaver, and they said that will not work. So the marshals began their threat assessment, and that's where another mistake is made. Since Randy Weaver had Green Beret training in the Army, perhaps they had seen too many Rambo movies. After all, Rambo was popular back in the 80s. They overestimated Randy Weaver's ability to make his place a hazard to them. They believed that he had the capability of making bombs out of his kitchen materials, which he did not. They also believed that he might have the place booby-trapped with bombs, mines everywhere they went, traps. That was not the case. But it's easy to judge the marshals with 2020 hindsight here.
When the Weaver case passed from the ATF to the marshals, no one informed the marshals that the ATF had attempted to solicit Weaver as an informant. The marshals were certain that Weaver was not a flight risk, even though the Canadian border was less than an hour's drive away. But they knew his religious beliefs were firmly entrenched, and part of those beliefs was a hatred of the Zionist-occupied federal government. Having no faith in the federal government from the start, and now firmly convinced the government could not be trusted and that its representatives were incompetent, Weaver simply stayed in his remote home, threatening to resist any attempt to take him by force. He and Vicky were now certain that there was a conspiracy against them and that they would not receive a fair trial. Plus, not only had he erroneously been told that he would lose his home if convicted, he was also told the government would take away his children. The marshals attempted to have Weaver surrender peacefully, but he refused to leave his cabin. He refused to speak directly with anyone, including his lawyer. So the marshals began preparing plans to capture Weaver, working surreptitiously. On March 4th, 1992, U.S. Deputy Marshals Ron Evans and Jack Clough drove to the Weaver property and spoke with Weaver, posing as real estate prospects. At a March 27th, 1992 meeting, Marshal Art Roderick codenamed the operation Northern Exposure, in homage to a popular TV show at the time. Surveillance teams were dispatched and cameras set up to record activity at Weaver's residence. Marshals observed that Weaver and his family responded to vehicles and other visitors by taking up armed positions around the cabin until the visitors were recognized. Arresting Randy Weaver would not be easy, and agents did not know who they could trust. Whenever muckraking journalist Geraldo Rivera shows up, nothing good comes about. On April 18, 1992, a helicopter hired by Rivera flew over the Weaver cabin, and it was reported that someone had fired at it. Although the reports were most likely false, and the chopper pilot denied that anyone had fired at him, the report was issued by the marshals as further evidence that the Weavers posed a threat. Operation Northern Exposure was suspended for 3 months due to the confirmation hearings of U.S. Marshal Service Director Henry Hudson.
When the Weavers first moved to Idaho from Iowa, they had 3 children. The oldest, Sarah, and Sammy, teenager, and the youngest daughter, Rachel. During the time when Randy Weaver was a fugitive from justice, Vicki Weaver gave birth to another child. This one, a girl they named Elishaba.
During this time, Vicki Weaver wrote letters to the U.S. Attorney from Idaho, Jim Jones, and addressed them to the Queen of Babylon, a moniker used by Aryan nations. She claimed that the tyrant's blood will flow. The Weavers did not leave their land during the 16 months after Randy was declared a fugitive. Although some friends and neighbors brought them supplies, the Weavers became increasingly paranoid and suspicious of anyone, sometimes menacingly so. Randy Weaver gave an interview in which he said he and his family were not giving up.
Randy Weaver's status as a fugitive from justice would go on for over a year, and the marshals periodically would send men out to surveil the area and try to figure out the best way to go about taking Randy Weaver into custody. Well, one fateful day, several marshals went to the land owned by Randy Weaver near his house. And Randy Weaver, his son Sammy, Kevin Harris, and one of the family dogs go into the woods that day. And the dog picks up the scent or the sound of these marshals, and that's when the problems start. Now, exactly who fired first, who did what, is somewhat in dispute. The official version says one thing, the Weavers say something else. And in the end, both sides had incentive to lie. But we do know this. At the end of this brief gunfight, Sammy Weaver, Weaver's teenage son, Marshal William or Billy Dagan were killed, and so was the family dog. And then the siege of the Weavers begins.
On August 21st, 1992, 6 marshals were sent to scout the area to determine suitable places away from the cabin to arrest Weaver. The marshals, dressed in military camouflage, were equipped with night vision goggles and M16 rifles. Deputy Marshals Art Roderick, Larry Cooper, and William F. Bill Dagan formed the reconnaissance team, while David Hunt, Joseph Thomas, and Frank Norris formed an observation post team on the ridge north of the cabin. At one point, Roderick threw 2 rocks at the Weaver cabin to test their dogs' reactions. Later, a dog named Stryker began following the agents. Weaver's friend Kevin Harris and Weaver's 14-year-old son Samuel followed Stryker to investigate. Harris and Sammy Weaver were hoping the dog had noticed a game animal as the cabin was out of meat. Roderick, Cooper, and Dagan initially retreated through the woods in radio contact with the OP team, but later took up hidden defensive positions. Sammy Weaver and Kevin Harris followed Stryker on foot through the woods, while Randy, also on foot, took a separate logging trail. The Weaver women and girls remained at the cabin. Randy Weaver encountered the marshals, and Roderick claimed to have yelled, "Back off, U.S. Marshal," upon sighting Weaver. And Cooper said he had shouted, "Stop, U.S. Marshals." By their account, Samuel and Stryker came out of the woods about a minute later. When the marshal's position was revealed by the dog Stryker, a yellow lab retriever, Deputy Roderick shot and killed the dog. Sammy Weaver reportedly said to the marshals, "You've killed my dog, you son of a bitch," and then shot in the direction of Roderick. Deputy Cooper then shot towards Sammy Weaver and Kevin Harris. Harris returned fire with a shot that killed Deputy Marshal William Francis Bill Dagan Jr. Sammy Weaver, now retreating up a hill, was then shot in the back and killed by Deputy Cooper. 19 rounds were fired during the fight, 1 by Deputy Roderick, 3 by Sammy Weaver, 7 by Deputy Dagan, 6 by Deputy Cooper, and 2 by Kevin Harris. Harris claimed he fired in self-defense. Cooper claimed he had not intended to kill Sammy Weaver. After the firefight, Hunt and Thomas went to a neighbor's house to call for assistance. Norris, Cooper, and Roderick stayed with Dagan's body. Randy and Vicky went to retrieve Samuel's body. Randy, Vicky, and Harris placed Sammy's body in a guest cabin near the main cabin, where it remained for several days. The marshals requested immediate support from Idaho law enforcement, and the FBI was informed. Idaho Governor Cecil Andrus declared a state of emergency in Boundary County and activated the Idaho National Guard. Armored personnel carriers were brought in, and Ruby Ridge assumed the look of an armed encampment. By the end of the siege, dozens of armored vehicles and hundreds of agents had descended on the Ruby Ridge area.
All right, so to this point, 2 federal law enforcement agencies are involved. Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms, who made the sawed-off shotgun case against Randy Weaver. The U.S. Marshals, whose job it was to hunt Randy Weaver down as a fugitive from justice. And now the FBI is involved because a federal agent has been killed. Another interesting dynamic is that these agencies don't always get along with each other and don't always cooperate. And the animosity is probably greatest toward the FBI.
The FBI sent its hostage rescue team to Idaho. Special agent in charge Eugene Glenn of the Salt Lake City FBI office was appointed site commander with responsibility for all active individuals from the FBI, ATF, and the Marshals. A standoff ensued which would last 11 days. Eugene Glenn would become a household name.
One of the key things that is in dispute here and was the most controversial was the rules of engagement that law enforcement was under. Usually, law enforcement is only allowed to use deadly force if there's an immediate threat to the safety of an officer or of a bystander. In this case, since an agent had been killed, the rules of engagement were altered, and there were memos floating around from person to person. And at the end of this, of course, there was damage control. Hey, I didn't write that, somebody else did, blah, blah, the old bureaucratic two-step. But at one point, there was a memorandum which said that in the case of the Weavers, since a marshal had been killed, that if they saw an adult with a weapon on the Weaver property, that deadly force can and should be used immediately.
The rules were later modified from adult to adult male to exclude the females because none of them were seen at the site of Dagan's slaying. Some deployed FBI agents, particularly the sniper observers, would later describe the adopted rules of engagement as a green light to shoot on sight.
And then the tragedy escalates with the shooting death of Vicky Weaver, the wounding of Kevin Harris, and the wounding of Randy Weaver.
On August 22nd, the Weavers and Kevin Harris left the cabin to take another look at Sammy's body. While walking back to the cabin, Agent Lon Horiuchi, from 200 yards away, shot Randy Weaver in the back and arm. The Weavers ran back to the cabin. As Vicky, holding her baby in her arms, stood next to the cabin door, Horiuchi fired a bullet that passed through Vicky's head and hit Harris in the chest. But no one outside the cabin was aware that Vicky had been shot and killed, as Horiuchi did not see her behind the door when he fired. The Weavers were convinced they were being hunted.
Sarah Weaver was the oldest of the Weaver children, teenager, and she still remembers very well, of course, that seeing her mother's brains blown out right in front of her and her blood and brain matter splattering her while Vicky Weaver was holding her infant daughter, Elishaba. That same bullet, when it exited Vicky Weaver's body, struck Kevin Harris, and he was seriously wounded as well.
On August 23rd, federal agents, while destroying buildings around the Weaver home, discovered the body of Sammy Weaver.
It took time for the word of this story to spread to the news media. At first, it was covered only by a few people in this region, a few entities in this region. But in time, the story of the Weavers caught fire, and Ruby Ridge became a rallying cry, rallying point for all sorts of right-wing groups with whom the Weavers had no affiliation.
Every day, a group of protesters would gather 2 miles from the Weaver cabin, shouting anti-government slogans and calling federal agents a disgrace to the white race. Some skinheads were arrested for trying to smuggle weapons to the Weavers.
As you might guess, the Weaver-Harris trial was covered prodigiously by the news media around the country, even in other countries as well.
The federal government was in a no-win situation. The situation had snowballed out of control, and they were not even aware of the death of Vicky Weaver. What had started out as an arrest on a minor felony gun charge had escalated into a public relations and legal nightmare. But the Weavers and Kevin Harris were giving the federal government the finger, and the whole world was watching.
Law enforcement was unaware that Vicki Weaver had been killed by Lon Toriuchi's bullet. They were also unaware that Kevin Harris was injured. And to make matters worse, and to demonstrate how things snowballed and became a cluster blank, as they say, negotiators would stand a distance away, of course, from the Weaver house and get on a bullhorn and talk into the Weaver's house loud enough for them to hear. And they were addressing Vicki, saying, "Vicki, how about coming out and giving your children some pancakes or a good breakfast? We had a good breakfast this morning. Bring your children out so they can enjoy some as well." They were unaware that Vicki Weaver was dead and lying on the kitchen floor of the Weaver home at this time. So to the Weavers and Kevin Harris, this seemed like cruel taunting.
That same day, August 24th, a government robot tried to take a telephone into the Weaver home, but Randy warned that he would shoot the robot, and the robot retreated. On Wednesday, August 26th, 4 days after Vicki was killed, news that had still not reached the FBI, the special rules of engagement were revoked, and the standard deadly force policy was reinstated.
The officer who killed Vicki Weaver and wounded Kevin Harris, Lon Toriuchi, claimed that he fired because he believed they were firing at a helicopter overhead. But then the memo about deadly force can and should be used came back to haunt federal law enforcement.
Later, the Department of Justice stated unequivocally that the rules that allow for the second shot to have been made did not satisfy constitutional standards for legal use of deadly force. Kevin Harris and the Weavers were running for cover at the time and did not pose an imminent threat. The Justice Department later criticized Toriuchi for firing through the door when he didn't know if anyone was on the other side of it. On or about Monday, August 24th, the fourth day of the siege, FBI Deputy Assistant Director Danny Colson, who didn't know that Vicki Weaver had been killed, wrote a memo about the Weaver's legal position. He wrote the following. 1. The charge against Weaver is bullshit. No one saw Weaver do any shooting. Vicki has no charges against her. Weaver's defense. He ran down the hill to see what the dog was barking at. Some guys in camouflage shot his dog, started shooting at him, killed his son. Harris did the shooting. He is in a pretty strong legal position.
And so the standoff continues. Federal law enforcement really had little use for Randy Weaver for some obvious reasons, and not just the killing of the U.S. Marshal. After all, he was not the one that fired the shot. But they branded Weaver a bit of a coward because for all his talk of the Old Testament, he was very democratic, in quotes, when it came to family matters. Perhaps Vicki Weaver was a stronger influence, perhaps the alpha in the family. But Randy Weaver would tell law enforcement that he allowed his daughters to take a vote about what to do. And his daughters, teenagers, voted to stick it out with Randy and not have their father turn themselves in. Now, I've read the Old Testament quite a bit. I'm not familiar with any Old Testament patriarchs that allowed their teenage daughters or their teenage children to dictate what the father did. As the story was spreading, word of the Weavers' situation reached Paul Harvey. Paul Harvey was a conservative news commentator based in Chicago. And Paul Harvey took to the airwaves, pleading with Randy Weaver to give himself up, saying that he would personally see that Randy Weaver was given legal representation.
Sometimes called the voice of Middle America, Paul Harvey was enormously popular with political conservatives, and he entertained audiences with his storytelling ability. Referring to the original gun charge, Harvey stated that federal law enforcement should concern itself with more serious crimes. But by this time, the Weavers were listening to no one, including Paul Harvey. But based on what others in the area told the FBI, and what they knew about Randy Weaver, they thought there was one person he would listen to. So that outsider volunteered to serve as mediator.
The outsider who was brought in was a man named Bo Greitz.
Born in Oklahoma in 1939, James Bo Greitz served in the U.S. Army Special Forces during the Vietnam War, but his fame came after the war. Greitz partially inspired several fictional film characters, including Colonel Kurtz in Apocalypse Now and the title character in the Rambo films. He led the chorus of people who believed, erroneously most likely, that Americans were being held prisoner in Vietnam long after the war ended in the mid-1970s. Business tycoon Ross Perot was among those who financed some of Greitz's efforts to investigate these claims. Greitz was a vice presidential candidate of the populist ticket in the 1988 presidential election and ran for president of the populist ticket in 1992. Although by the early 1990s, Greitz's right-wing agenda, animosity toward the United Nations, In opposition to the First Persian Gulf War made him anathema to the Department of Defense and the federal government, the FBI was desperate, so they worked with Bo Gritz.
Bo Gritz was actually able to communicate with Randy Weaver and relay information from Weaver to the FBI and vice versa. And then the news hit that Vicki Weaver was dead.
Randy Weaver told Colonel Gritz that Vicki was dead, that her body was still in the cabin. Gritz relayed the news to the FBI, also telling them that federal law enforcement had really screwed the situation up. A distraught Jean Glenn announced the news to the press. Weaver told Gritz that his two daughters had vowed they'd rather die, perhaps sacrificing their infant sister in the process, than give their father and Kevin Harris up. Gritz replied that if Weaver allowed that to happen, and if he allowed Kevin Harris to die in his cabin, he would testify against him in court. By now, Kevin Harris was urging Weaver for a mercy killing. Randy Weaver allowed the removal of his wife's body, which Gritz oversaw.
Thanks to the mediation, Bo Gritz, Randy Weaver, and Kevin Harris did indeed give themselves up.
In desperate need of medical attention, Kevin Harris surrendered on August 30th. Jean Glenn gave Gritz a deadline to get the remaining Weavers to surrender, and if he didn't surrender on the day of the deadline, he said he would resolve the standoff by launching a tactical assault. Weaver and his daughters surrendered the next day.
Now Randy Weaver is in custody. He's awaiting trial, as is Kevin Harris, for the murder of Agent or Marshal William Dagan. The drama continues, and now the three principal agencies involved in this case, the ATF, the Marshals, and the FBI, are engaging and battling each other for damage control.
Weaver's three daughters were released to the custody of relatives. Randy Weaver was given a brief medical examination and then held at the Ada County Jail in Boise and arraigned in federal court the following day, Tuesday, September 1st.
Now I'm coming to you from Boise, Idaho's largest city and state capital. Don't know if you checked the map recently, but Idaho is a very large state in terms of area, particularly north to south. Say from in Boise to Naples, Idaho, or where Randy Weaver lived, it's over 400 miles. Now you got to remember something here. Randy Weaver was tried in federal court, not in local court, because the crime he committed or was accused of committing was a federal crime. One, selling the sawed-off shotgun to an undercover informant for the ATF. And two, he and Kevin Harris were accused of murdering a federal agent. So therefore, that makes it a federal case and not a local or state case. In local cases, the jury pool or the jurors are composed of people from that county. Now, if Randy Weaver had been tried in state court, a local court up in the northern part of Idaho, he would have been tried by people, both the prosecutor, the judge, and the jurors, many of whom would probably have a like mind, people who lived in that area, or at least resented the federal government. But Randy Weaver, because the case, and Kevin Harris, because the case was transferred to federal court, were tried here in Boise in federal court. Now, where I am now, just for what it's worth, this is a statue of former Governor Frank Steunenberg, who was assassinated by a labor radical back in 1905. So that's significant because the jury pool here may have been quite different from the jury pool up in the northern part of the state. Although I've been summoned for jury duty before in federal court, one knows that the juror pool does not come just from that local county. It comes from throughout that district. So the jury pool in this case came from throughout much of Idaho, but there were not local citizens of Boundary County up in the northern part of Idaho. Even though that was the case, a lot of jurors say in Boise and surrounding areas here are perhaps a bit more metropolitan, a bit less conservative than Randy Weaver, a bit less radical in their beliefs. A lot of people in that jury pool still owned weapons and were pretty politically conservative. It's pretty common in a high-profile case for high-profile lawyers to get involved. And in some cases, even though the defendants don't have very much money and the lawyers know they won't get much money from the defendant, they'll take on the case for the publicity it brings and for the indirect monetary benefits it might bring. Such was the case here with Randy Weaver and Kevin Harris, involving one of the most well-known criminal defense attorneys in the West.
Born in Wyoming in 1929, Gerald Spence was one of the greatest criminal defense attorneys of his lifetime until his death in August 2025. Spence never lost a criminal or civil case in his career, and he was known as much for his showmanship as for his acumen in the courtroom. Plus, in this case, his Western dress and folksy demeanor, which stood in contrast to his button-down, starched shirt prosecutor opponents, were just what Randy Weaver needed. Spence disagreed with Weaver's regular religious beliefs. In fact, when he first met Weaver, Spence told him flatly he did not want to hear any of his quote-unquote bullshit beliefs about blacks and Jewish conspiracies, that he had plenty of black and Jewish friends, and wanted no part of his ideals. But Spence believed federal officials had entrapped Weaver and had behaved unconscionably in shooting the unarmed Vicki Weaver. Spence was assisted by his son Kent and Chuck Peterson. Kevin Harris was represented by David Nevin and Ellison Matthews. Weaver's and Harris's trial in U.S. District Court in Boise began in April 1993 and was presided over by Judge Edward Lodge. In mid-June, the defense rested without calling any witnesses for the defense. Their goal was to discredit the government's case through cross-examination, and it worked.
This case took its toll on a lot of people. And of course, the Weavers and Kevin Harris and the federal officers involved in the standoff. But also, once the case got to court, it took a humongous toll on some of the people involved, including one of the prosecutors and including one of the jurors. Although we don't know for sure because we don't keep meticulous records, I haven't for at least not a long time ago, of how long jury deliberations last. It's believed that the jury deliberations here in the Weaver-Harris case were the longest in Idaho history.
Lead prosecutor Ron Howen was so frazzled by the end of the trial that he had to withdraw before finishing his closing statement. He would stay gone for 2 weeks. Jury deliberations were incredibly acrimonious, and the jurors were sequestered during deliberations, totally shut off from the outside world, even riding in buses with windows covered. Deliberations lasted 5 weeks, prolonged in part by the withdrawal of Cyril Hatfield, the jury foreman, who suffered a nervous breakdown and simply could not continue and had to be replaced. In July, Weaver was acquitted of all the charges except the charge he incurred by missing his original court date and the charge of violating his bail condition, for which he was sentenced to 18 months imprisonment and fined $10,000 in October. Credited with time served in good behavior, Weaver served less than 16 months, and he was released from the Canyon County Jail in Caldwell in mid-December. Kevin Harris was acquitted of all charges. Exactly 5 years after the incident, he was indicted for the first-degree murder of Deputy Bill Dagan by Boundary County Prosecutor Denise Woodbury, but the charge was dismissed in early October on grounds of double jeopardy because he had been acquitted of that same charge in federal criminal trial in 1993. The Department of Justice created the Ruby Ridge Task Force to investigate the events. It delivered a 542-page report on June 10, 1994. The internal 1994 Ruby Ridge Task Force report and the public 1995 Senate Subcommittee report on Ruby Ridge both criticized the rules of engagement by claiming they are unconstitutional. In 1997, Michael Cahoe, the chief of the FBI's Violent Crime Section, pled guilty to obstruction of justice for destroying a report, which is critical of the agency's role at Ruby Ridge. He was sentenced to 18 months and a $4,000 fine.
Randy Weaver and Kevin Harris filed suit against the federal government as a result of this case and received an award. And now the blame game continued. Who was at fault?
Randy Weaver and his daughters filed a wrongful death suit for $200 million, which was related to the killing of his wife and son. In an out-of-court settlement in August 1995, the federal government awarded Randy Weaver $100,000, and it also awarded $1 million to each of his 3 daughters. The government did not admit that it had committed any wrongdoing in relation to the deaths of Samuel and Vicki. The attorney for Harris pressed Harris' civil suit for damages, but federal officials vowed they would never pay someone who had killed a U.S. Marshal. In September 2000, Harris was awarded a $380,000 settlement by the government. In 1997, Boundary County Prosecutor Denise Woodbury indicted FBI HRT sniper Lon Horiuchi for manslaughter. She appointed a special prosecutor to conduct the case. But in 1998, the trial was removed to federal court because Horiuchi had been acting in the line of duty as a federal law enforcement officer. Judge Edward Lodge quickly dismissed the case on grounds of sovereign immunity. The decision to dismiss charges was reversed in 2001 by the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals, ruling the case could be tried in state court. But by now, Boundary County Prosecutor Brent Benson, who had defeated Woodbury in the May 2000 primary and won the November election, decided to drop the case, believing he could not secure a conviction and that letting the case go would begin the healing process for the county. Stephen Yagman, who had been appointed special prosecutor, disagreed with the decision.
What happened to the Weaver family and Kevin Harris after this ordeal? Kevin Harris, by all accounts, lives a fairly quiet life, as do the Weaver children. Although Sarah Weaver has participated in documentaries. She has also distanced herself from her father's belief, but not her father, but she has distanced herself from her father and mother's religious beliefs and embraced mainstream Christianity. Sarah Weaver has also said that she forgives the men who killed her brother and mother.
Randy Weaver testified about his racial beliefs before a U.S. Senate Judiciary Committee in 1995. He said, "I'm not a hateful racist as most people understand it, but I believe in the separation of races. We wanted to be separated from the rest of the world, to live in a remote area, to give our children a good place to grow up."
As for Randy Weaver, he was not totally finished trying to profit or showboat as a result of this ordeal, and he tried to insert himself into similar situations several times.
In April 1996, Weaver accompanied Bo Gritz to Montana, where Gritz was attempting to negotiate a conclusion to the Montana-Freeman standoff. But Weaver was not allowed by the FBI to enter the Freeman's holdout. In 1998, Weaver published The Federal Siege at Ruby Ridge in Our Own Words, which she partly sold in person at gun shows. In 1999, Weaver married Linda Gross, a legal secretary, in Jefferson, Iowa. In 2007, Weaver participated in a press conference with tax protesters Edward and Elaine Brown on the front porch of their home in New Hampshire. He declared, "I ain't afraid of dying no more. I'm curious about the afterlife, and I'm an atheist." Randy Weaver died on May 11, 2022, at the age of 74.
For all the talk about the Weavers and Kevin Harris, what about William Dagan and his family?
William Dagan was buried in his hometown of North Quincy, Massachusetts. For several years afterwards, a golf tournament and other events for the benefit of his family was held. His son William joined the U.S. Marshal Service as well. U.S. Marshals Director Henry Hudson stated, "Bill Dagan died in the company of his friends, performing the duties he enjoyed most and the job he loved. His bravery will set a standard by which every deputy U.S. Marshal will be measured."
As I'm sitting here in a Zips drive-in, a popular burger chain here in Idaho, I'm reminded of another tragedy that may have come out of the Weaver case. And it involves a Swiss chef, an immigrant Swiss chef, who hosted and fed a lot of the people involved in this situation on both sides, and how this event traumatized him. It may have led to his death.
Lawrence Kadoof was a Swiss immigrant to Boundary County who operated a diner there. He had only been in Idaho 6 weeks when the killings of Sammy Weaver and Bill Dagan occurred. As he watched the nightmare unfold, Kadoof could not believe this was happening in America, a military-like siege against one family, and the hateful actions of some of Weaver's supporters. Shortly after the siege ended, Kadoof began to exhibit signs of severe mental illness with violent outbursts. He was struck and killed by a truck in November of that year. His widow claimed that her husband was another victim of the Ruby Ridge incident. On April 19, 1995, 2 Army veterans, Timothy McVeigh and Terry Nichols, detonated a truck bomb in front of the Alfred P. Murrah Federal Building in Oklahoma City. 168 people were killed, mostly U.S. government employees. 19 of the victims were babies and children, many in the building's daycare center. They stated the federal government's poor handling of Ruby Ridge motivated them to carry out the bombing.
Although Randy Weaver and Kevin Harris should bear much of the blame for what happened here, I'm reminded of something that a Georgia governor once said when asked how to improve the prison system. His response was, "Well, we need a better class of inmate." Law enforcement and the government has to recognize there will always be criminals, always people like Randy Weaver. The question for the government is the best response.
A CBS miniseries about the Ruby Ridge incident titled Ruby Ridge, an American Tragedy aired in 1996. It was based on the book Every Knee Shall Bow by Jess Walter. It starred Laura Dern as Vicky, Kirsten Dunst as Sarah, and Randy Quaid as Randy. The series was adapted as a full-length TV movie, The Siege at Ruby Ridge. In 1999, bluegrass musician Peter Rowan addressed the events at Ruby Ridge in his song, The Ballad of Ruby Ridge. Ruby Ridge was the subject of a Criminal Minds episode in 2007. The question remains, was this an example of government overreach, or should all the blame be placed solely on Randy Weaver?
Well, I hope you enjoyed this edition of Crime Chronicles. As we delve into the darker side of human nature, we invite you to join us on our journey by liking and subscribing to our YouTube channel. Your support helps make possible our inquiry into the sometimes unsettling but always fascinating phenomenon known as crime and justice. So hit that like and subscribe button right now and don't miss future episodes. Till then, Mark Jones, hoping you will join our Crime Chronicles community. And thanks for tuning in.